3:12 a.m. at Ether Systems didn't sound like the future. It sounded like a freight train derailment in slow motion. The apex cluster, a $200 million grid of AI processing power, was screaming. Not a digital scream, but a physical one. The cooling racks, encased in reinforced glass and liquid nitrogen jackets, were vibrating with such violence they were a blur of obsidian and steel. The manifold is it critical. Dr. Aris Vane, the CTO, whose face had graced the cover of Wired twice, was shrieking at his monitors. The software's frequency hunting. Why won't the dampers engage? 6 world-class engineers were frantically typing, their fingers dancing over holographic interfaces, desperate to find the line of code that would stop the thermal runaway. They were looking for a digital ghost. They believed that a problem this expensive could only be solved by an equation just as complex. Elias Thorne didn't look for ghosts. He looked at the floor, wearing a gray jumpsuit with a faded name tag that simply read Elias. He dropped his mop. He didn't ask permission. He stepped past the authorized personnel-only laser grid and walked directly to the base of Rack 4 from his pocket. He pulled a small, hand-carved wooden wedge. He jammed it under the front left leveling foot with a single, sharp kick of his boot. The roar died instantly. The vibration vanished, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum. Elias looked up at the stunned CTO. Your code is hunting for a balance point that doesn't exist because your floor is off by 4 degrees. The manifold was hitting a mechanical resonance. He wiped a smudge of grease from the glass. You have 10 seconds before the vacuum seal cracks. Level the rack, Dr. Vane, or buy a new building. The secret Elias saw in seconds had eluded the brightest minds in Silicon Valley. And it was a secret that was about to change everything. The morning sun didn't just shine on the Ether Systems building. It was weaponized by it. The HQ was a 60-story spire of hyper-reflective glass and black steel that loomed over the city like a silent god. Inside, the air was filtered to a surgical grade, chilled to a precise 68 degrees to keep the thousands of servers humming in their sterile neon-lit racks. There were no paper files here, no pens, no clutter. The building was a cathedral of the invisible, a monument to code, algorithms, and the digital ether. Elias Thorne moved through the lobby like a glitch in the system. At 42 he was a man of dense, functional muscle, his shoulders carrying a permanent set of heavy lifting. He wore a gray industrial jumpsuit, the fabric worn thin at the knees, with a utility belt that carried spray bottles and microfiber cloths instead of a multi-dash tool. To the engineers and analysts who darted past him with their encrypted tablets, Elias was a ghost. Here's a biological filter, a human machine tasked with erasing the physical residue of their existence. Every smudge on a glass partition was a crime against the digital purity of Ether Systems. Every coffee ring was a failure of the paperless dream. Elias was currently kneeling near the intake vents of the primary server lobby, his large calloused hands meticulously wiping dust from the brushed steel grates. He didn't just clean, he listened. He could hear the building's circulatory system. He knew when a fan bearing was drifting out of alignment by 3 microns. He knew when the liquid cooling system was experiencing a pressure drop before the sensors even flagged it. He understood the physical reality of the machine, the heat, the friction, and the rust that the software teams refused to acknowledge. The elevator chimes rang with a melodic, expansive sound. Julian Thorne, the vice president of infrastructure, stepped out, leading a group of 20 wide-eyed interns and 3 high-profile investors. Julian was 35, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elias made in a year, and carried a sense of entitlement that was almost atmospheric. He was the golden boy of Ether, a man who believed that if a problem couldn't be solved with a line of Python, it wasn't worth solving. Julian stopped the tour 10 feet from where Elias was kneeling. He didn't lower his voice. And here, Julian said, gesturing toward Elias with a manicured hand, we see a relic of the prodigal era. We call them the shadows. Men like Elias are the biological filters of our infrastructure. They exist because, despite our best efforts, the physical world still insists on producing dust and waste. The interns chuckled a low sound. Elias didn't look up. He kept his focus on the steel grate. He felt the heat of their gaze like a physical weight against his back. Julian walked closer, his leather loafers clicking sharply on the marble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a greasy, crumpled wrapper from a fast-food breakfast burrito. He looked at the investors, a smirk playing on his lips. We talk about the clean cloud, but people forget that the cloud is held up by steel and dirt, Julian said. He casually opened his hand, letting the greasy wrapper flutter to the floor, landing inches from Elias's mop bucket. The wrapper left a dark, oily smear on the white marble. You missed a spot, Elias, Julian said, his voice dripping with a calculated polite disdain. Try to keep up. I'd hate for the investors to think we're running a warehouse instead of a technological frontier. These blue-collar hands are the reason we have security walls, not just to keep the hackers out, but to keep the dust from the street from clogging the future. One of the investors smiled, tapping a stylus against his palm. It's a pity, really. How much of the budget goes to manual labor? 5%? 10%? Too much. Julian hissed, leaning in so only Elias could hear the full venom. "You're an overhead cost, Elias. A line item I'm looking to delete. The only reason you're still here is that the automation hasn't perfected the disgusting tasks yet. But don't worry, I'm working on the code. Until then, scrub the wrapper, and do it quickly. You're making the air smell like the street." Julian turned back to the tour, his voice rising again as he led them toward the high-security server vaults. "Moving on to the Apex cluster, the most powerful AI processing grid on the planet, where we have finally eliminated the human error factor entirely." Elias stood still. He looked at the greasy wrapper. He looked at the oily smear on the marble. He felt the scar on his right palm, a remnant of a high-voltage arc from a project 10 years ago that these men would never have the clearance to know about. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his mind or his history. He simply knelt back down, his rag in hand, and began to erase the evidence of Julian's arrogance. He scrubbed the marble until it shone with a cold, unforgiving light. He was a ghost. He was the background noise. And in less than 24 hours, the clean cloud would start to burn. And Julian Thorne would find out that while code can build a world, only a man with grease-stained hands knows how to stop it from falling apart. The bus ride back to the Low District always felt like a slow descent from a mountain of glass into a valley of rust. Elias sat in the back, his tool bag between his boots, watching the city's skyline shift. The glittering spires of the technological elite faded, replaced by the gray, salt-eroded brick of the old shipping district. He didn't think about Julian Thorne's mocking laughter. He didn't think about the greasy wrapper he'd been forced to scrub. He thought about the numbers. From $100 a week for Leo's sensory therapy, $300 for the specialized neurosupplements, the rent, the utilities. Numbers never stopped adding up. And a janitor's salary was a thin shield against a rising tide of debt. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up, groaned every time a freight train rattled the tracks 3 blocks away. It was a space of 40-degree corners and peeling wallpaper, but inside the door, it was a fortress of order. Elias had spent a decade designing server architectures where a single millimeter of misalignment could cause a catastrophic short. He lived his life by those same tolerances now. He set his keys in a small wooden tray by the door and moved silently through the dim hallway. He didn't turn on the lights. He knew exactly where the floorboards creaked. "Leo," he whispered. "Dot in." The corner of the small living room, a 9-year-old boy was sitting on a thick rug, his back against the wall. He was wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones, his eyes shut tight. Leo didn't look like other children. He had a stillness to him that was almost eerie, his hands moving in a rhythmic, repetitive motion, thumb to pinky, thumb to ring finger. Elias sat on the floor, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't touch him. He knew that for Leo, a sudden touch was like a high-voltage shock to the nervous system. "The train's gone, Leo," Elias said softly, his voice a low, steady anchor. "The noise is back to green." Leo opened his eyes, the same reef blue eyes as his father. He slowly pulled the headphones down around his neck. "It was a grade for rumble, Dad." The third car had a flat spot on the wheel. "Clackus, clackus." Elias nodded. He didn't dismiss the boy's observation. He knew Leo didn't just hear sound. He processed it as raw data. "I'll report it to the city." "Good catch." Leo reached beside him and picked up a small, heavy object. It was a hand-carved wooden logic puzzle, a complex series of interlocking cubes made of dark walnut and light maple. Elias had built it himself in the nights when he couldn't sleep. It was the symbolic object of their lives, a bridge between a father who understood the world's mechanics and a son who was overwhelmed by its chaos. Elias watched his son's fingers trace the wood. He felt a familiar, sharp ache in his chest, the secret burden that dictated every choice he made. Years ago, Elias Thorne hadn't been a janitor. He had been the lead hardware architect for Titan Dynamics, the company that had pioneered the first large-scale liquid-cooled server clusters. He was the ghost of ether, the man who had designed the very foundations of the digital world Julian Thorne now claimed to own. He had been a man of patents, 6-figure bonuses, and a brilliant, laughing wife named Alina. But Titan Dynamics had been obsessed with the efficiency update, a software patch that pushed the hardware to its absolute limit to save on cooling costs. Elias had warned them. He had written a memo, 30 pages of hard data, explaining that the physical architecture couldn't survive the thermal load. The board had suppressed the memo. They had fired him and scrubbed his professional history, using non-disclosure agreements and non-compete clauses to bury him. 2 weeks later, the server farm he had designed experienced a catastrophic thermal runaway. The resulting blackout would shut down the regional hospital's secondary power grid. Alina, who was in post-op recovery after Leo's birth, had been caught in the crossfire of the system failure. Elias had walked away from the wreckage of his life. He didn't want the lawsuits. He didn't want the money. He wanted to be invisible. He took the janitor job at Ether because it was the one place no one would ever look for a genius. He worked the night shift so he could be home during the day for Leo's therapy. He lived off the grid, a man with a dead resume and a heart made of scar tissue. "I can't find the center, Dad." Leo whispered, his hands trembling as he tried to force two pieces of the walnut puzzle together. The map. In my head is wrongy, it won't click. Elias moved closer, his large, scarred hands gently covering Leo's. He didn't take the puzzle, he just anchored Leo's hands. Don't force it, Leo, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. In the machine, and in the world, force is just another word for failure. When the map is wrong, it means the noise is too loud. He took one maple block and turned it 45 degrees. He didn't push it, he just let it slide, clicked the puzzle, settled into a perfect, seamless cube. When the world gets too loud, Leo, you have to find the one piece that doesn't fit, Elias said, looking his son in the eyes. Most people try to fix the whole machine at once. They look at the big screens and the loud sirens. But the secret is always in the small thing. Find the piece that's fighting the grain. Fix that, and the rest goes quiet. Leo traced the smooth surface of the cube, his breathing finally leveling out. Trust the wood, not the light. Always, Elias said. He stood up, his body aching from the long shift. He looked at the clock. 5 p.m. In 3 hours, he would put on the gray jumpsuit. He would take the bus back to the glass cathedral. He would mop the floors where Julian Thorne walked, and he would empty the trash filled with the brilliance of men who didn't know a wrench from a wire. He was a ghost. He was the background noise. But as he looked at Leo, who was now calmly resetting the puzzle, Elias knew that he was the only man in the city who understood that. Ether's digital empire was built on a foundation of vibrating steel and thermo. Stress. The clean cloud was hunting for a balance point that didn't exist. And Elias Thorne, the man with the mop, was the only one who knew that the map was about to burn. He went to the small kitchen and began preparing Leo's dinner, a precise arrangement of foods that didn't touch the same routine every night. He didn't need the world to know his name. He didn't need Julian's respect. He just needed to keep the noise away from his son. But as he looked at his knuckles, stained with a residue of 100 different chemicals, he knew that tonight the machine was going to scream. And this time, he wouldn't be able to stay in the shadows. The night shift at Ether Systems was a symphony played in a minor key. 2 a.m. The sunlight that usually masked the building's imperfections was replaced by the harsh, unflattering hum of overhead fluorescence. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the rhythmic breathing of the building, the low-frequency rumble of the industrial HVAC systems, the surgical click of cooling servers, and the distant high-pitched whine of the primary data vaults. Elias Thorne moved through the Apex Gallery, a glass-walled corridor that overlooked the crown jewel of Ether, the Apex Cluster. It was a 3-story cage of reinforced carbon fiber racks, each one housing hundreds of liquid-cooled processing cores that glowed with a rhythmic, pulsating blue light. This was the engine that powered the world's most advanced AI simulations. On paper, it was a masterpiece of digital architecture. To Elias, it was a physical organism under extreme stress. He was currently mopping the high-gloss black tile of the gallery, his movements invisible to the security cameras and the few junior engineers monitoring the vitals from a remote station. But as he reached the center of the gallery, he stopped. He didn't look at the monitors displaying 99.8% efficiency. He looked at the secondary manifold, a thick, insulated line that carried the super-chilled coolant into the heart of the cluster. He set his mop aside and pressed his ear against the glass partition there. Beneath the standard 60 Hz hum of the power supply was a secondary frequency, a predatory, high-pitched whistle that sounded like a tea kettle at the gates of hell. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in a decade, but he recognized it in his marrow. Laminar flow turbulence, Elias whispered to the empty glass. He didn't need a diagnostic tablet. He was running the fluid dynamics in the quiet, disciplined space. Behind his eyes, he knew exactly what had happened. Ether had pushed a new firmware update to the pump controllers to optimize power consumption. They were trying to tell the coolant to move faster while using less energy. But they had ignored the Reynolds number of the fluid, the point where smooth's efficient flow becomes a chaotic, violent mess. The coolant wasn't flowing anymore. It was hunting. It was creating microcavitation bubbles against the internal walls of the manifold. Every whistle he heard was a microscopic explosion of air against steel. At the current pressure, the manifold was becoming a jackhammer, vibrating at a frequency that would eventually shatter the vacuum seals. Elias looked at his scarred hands. He looked at his gray jumpsuit. He knew he should stay silent. He was a ghost, a man with a dead resume and a son who needed him to keep his head down. But an architect could not watch a masterpiece be destroyed by a software error. He walked toward the executive, bridged a glass-walled office that hung over the gallery like a predator's nest. Julian Thorne was still there, hunched over a back desk, his face illuminated by the cold glow of a presentation deck he was preparing for tomorrow's launch. Elias didn't knock. He simply stepped into the doorway, his mop bucket trailing a faint scent of lemon-scented floor wax. Julian didn't look up immediately. He finished a line of text, then slowly raised his head, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the man in the jumpsuit. Elias, did I give you permission to enter the bridge? Or has the manual labor department decided that rules are as obsolete as their skill sets? The Apex cluster is redlining, Mr. Thorne, Elias said, His voice wasn't the flat, anonymous rasp of a janitor. It was steady, precise, and devoid of the fear Julian expected. Julian leaned back, a mocking smile touching his lips. Redlining. The monitors show a 99.8% stability rating. Our AI Aegis is managing the thermal load with a precision that would make God blush. Are you suggesting that your ears are more accurate than 10,000 lines of proprietary code? The code is hunting for a balance point that doesn't exist, Elias said, stepping toward the glass. You've pushed the pump frequency to 400 Hz to save on the power draw, but you've triggered a harmonic resonance in the primary manifold. You're experiencing firmware-induced cavitation. If you don't reduce the flow velocity by 12% and recalculate the Reynolds limit, the manifold is going to experience a structural failure in the next 6 hours. The room went dead silent. Julian stood up, his face transitioning from amusement to an incandescent cold fury. He didn't understand the technical jargon Elias had just used. He was an operations man, a climber of hierarchies, but the authority in Elias's voice, and to Julian Elias's voice that only people with charcoal suits were allowed to possess. Cavitation. Reynolds limb. Julian spat the words out like they were a joke. Where did you learn those words? Elias, did you watch a YouTube video while you were cleaning the toilets? Or did you steal an engineering textbook from the bin? He walked around the desk, stopping inches from Elias. Let me be very clear. You're a biological filter. You are the shadow who empties the trash. The only reason you are allowed near this hardware is that the robots can't yet identify which stains are coffee and which are grease. You suggesting that our hardware team missed a mechanical resonance isn't just a delusion, it's an insult. Julian looked at Elias's tool belt. He reached out and grabbed a small, worn screwdriver Elias kept affixing the wheels on his mop bucket. He held it up like it was a piece of garbage. You want to help? Julian hissed. You want to contribute to the frontier of ether systems? He walked to the primary intake vent near the floor, a massive, intricate grate that filtered the air entering the cluster's cooling racks. He threw the screwdriver into the corner. I noticed a smudge on the internal fins of the intake vent, Julian said, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. It's a 5-micron error in the purity of the room. Since you're so concerned with mechanical precision, I want you to clean those vents. Every single fin, on your knees. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a standard, cheap plastic toothbrush. He dropped it at Elias's feet. You use this, Julian said. If I see you near a terminal again, or if I hear another word of your Backley engineering advice, I won't just fire you. I'll sue you for corporate espionage. I'll tell the board you were trying to inject a hardware exploit into the cluster. I'll make sure you never work a night shift in this city again. Julian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Men like you don't solve problems. Elias, you are the problem. You are the dust we have to erase. Now, get on your knees and scrub, and don't stop until those vents shine. Elias Thorne stood still. He looked at the toothbrush on the floor. He looked at the man whose ego was currently blinding him to a $200 million disaster. He thought of Leo, sleeping in a room that smelled of old wallpaper. He thought of the medical bills. He didn't argue. He didn't show the fury that was a white coal in his chest. He slowly knelt on the cold tile. He picked up the toothbrush. Yes, sir, Elias said quietly as Julian walked away, his leather loafers clicking with the sound of victory. Elias began to scrub the steel vents. Asterisk 1 fin, 2 fins. Asterisk behind the glass of the cluster. The high-pitched whistle was getting louder. The clean cloud was already starting to fracture. And Elias Thorne, the man with the toothbrush, was the only one in the building who knew that the timer had already begun. He scrubbed, and he listened. He heard the cavitation. He heard the manifold groan. And he knew that in less than 4 hours, the geniuses would find out that while code can build a world, it cannot stop a structural collapse once the physics say it's time to break. The 38th floor of Ether Systems was no longer an office. It was a high-tech stage designed for a corporate coronation under the glare of strategically placed halogen floods. The Apex Gallery looked like a scene from a science fiction movie. 6 of the world's most powerful investors, men who controlled the pension funds of entire nations, stood in a semicircle around the glass-enclosed server cage. They were holding crystal flutes of sparkling mineral water. Alcohol was banned in the presence of the machines, and their eyes were fixed on a massive holographic projection of the Apex Cluster's vidas. Sarah Chun, the CEO of Ether Systems, stood at the center. She was a woman of 45 who moved with the quiet, predatory grace of someone who had survived 3 separate market crashes. She didn't talk much. She let the data speak. Beside her, Julian Thorne was in his element. He was the master of ceremonies, his charcoal suit reflecting the neon blue glow of the server racks. He was gesturing wildly at the holographic displays, his voice amplified by a localized speaker system. What you are seeing, gentlemen, Julian said, his voice brimming with a manufactured electric excitement, is the final death of the physical limit. For 40 years, the industry has been held back by the thermal ceiling, the point where hardware simply cannot process fast enough without melting. But today, with our Aegis AI managing the cooling distribution, We have finally broken the wall. We are currently idling at 98% capacity with zero structural stress. In the shadows beneath the primary observation catwalk, Elias Thorne was on his knees. He was 50 feet away from the investors, tucked into the dark corner where the intake vents met the floor. He was still holding the plastic toothbrush Julian had given him. His knees ached against the cold tile, and his hands were cramped from the repetitive motion of cleaning the steel fins. To the world above him, he was less than a person. He was a piece of maintenance furniture. Elias looked at the manifold, the thick, insulated line that fed the liquid nitrogen into the server racks. He didn't need a hologram to tell him the status. He could feel it in the floor. The whistle he had heard during the night shift had evolved. It was now a visceral low-frequency throb that he felt in his teeth. It was a rhythmic hunting sound. The manifold was vibrating at a frequency that was perfectly matched to the structural resonance of the rack space. The secret everyone is looking at on the screens, Elias thought, is a lie. The software was showing green because the sensors were only measuring the core temperature. They weren't measuring the mechanical strain on the delivery pipes. The one warning they chose to ignore was the physical reality of the machine. We are now transitioning to phase 2, Julian announced, his finger hovering over a glass top interface. We are going to push the Apex cluster to 110% of its rated capacity. We are going to show you that Ether doesn't just meet expectations, we redefine the physics of possibility. Sarah Chun stepped closer to the display. Her brow furrowed slightly. Julian, the manifold pressure is already at the upper limit of the safety envelope. Is the AI accounting for the flow turbulence? Julian laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the glass. Sarah, please. Aegis is running 1 trillion simulations per second. It's compensating for variables we haven't even named yet. The hardware is just a vessel. The code is the captain. If he hit the execute button, the sound that followed was unlike anything the investors had ever heard. It wasn't a roar. It was a high-velocity scream, like a jet engine trying to pull a mountain. The pulsating blue lights in the server racks turned a jagged, unstable white. On the holographic display, the numbers began to climb. 102%, 105%, 108%. Pressure is spiking in the primary manifold. Dr. Vane's voice crackled over the internal comms from the remote station. He sounded terrified. We have a Reynolds number deviation. The coolant is turning to froth. We're losing thermal transfer. Increase pump velocity. Julian barked, his face turning a dark shade of red. Override the safety gates. We need more flow. Force the coolant through. Elias Thorne stood up. He dropped the toothbrush. He looked at the manifold. He saw it sweating microscopic droplets of frost were being shaken loose from the insulation by the violent vibration. He knew exactly what Julian had just done. By increasing the pump velocity to force the flow, Julian had just tripled the cavitation. He had turned a leaky pipe into a pressurized bomb. Julian, stop! Sarah Chun's voice was like a whip crack. She'd seen the vibration. She had seen the way the glass partition was starting to hum. Abort the test, vent the manifold. Now, we can abort. Julian yelled, his eyes wild with a mixture of ego and panic. If we stop now, the thermal shock will shatter the processors we have to punch through. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot rang out through the gallery. Crack a hairline. Fracture appeared in the secondary manifold coupling. A high-pressure jet of superchilled, conductive coolant sprayed out, hitting the intake fans. The liquid was instantly vaporized into a white, blinding mist that began to fill the server cage. Coolant leak. Vane screamed over the PA conductor. Vapor in the intake. We have a terminal short-circuit risk. The system is entering a runaway feedback loop. The investors didn't wait for a polite exit. They dropped their flutes to Cristo, shattering on the floor, and scrambled for the emergency stairwell. They were men of data, and the data currently said they were about to be in the center of a $200 million explosion. Julian Thorne stood frozen at the console, his hands hovering over the touchscreen. The digital captain had just steered the ship into a hurricane, and the geniuses had no idea how to use a wrench. Julian was staring at the black screen, his operations logic completely useless against the physical reality of the disaster he had triggered. The mist was getting thicker. The white strobe of the servers was now a continuous, blinding glare. Sarah, get back! Julian yelled, finally moving, trying to pull the CEO toward the exit. It's going to blow. The manifold is going to rupture. Sarah Chun didn't move. She stood at the glass, her face illuminated by the failing light of her empire. She wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at the intake vents near the floor. She saw a man in a gray jumpsuit. Elias Thorne wasn't running. He was moving toward the cleaning closet, his stride heavy and deliberate. He didn't look like a janitor anymore. The stoop was gone. The invisibility was gone. He looked like a man who was walking into a battle he had already won a dozen times before. Sarah watched as Elias reached into the closet and pulled out a heavy-duty industrial zip tie and a simple wooden pencil. Elias, Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the roar of the manifold. "What are you doing? Get out of here!" Elias didn't answer. He vaulted over the security rail, landing on the server room floor with a heavy thud. He moved through the white mist, his eyes locked on the vibrating manifold. He knew the secret. He knew that the manifold wasn't breaking because of the pressure. It was breaking because of the resonance. The rack was hunting for a center that Julian had erased with his efficiency. Update. As the secondary alarm began to scream a continuous death knell tone, Elias Thorne reached for the manifold coupling. He had exactly 10 seconds before the vacuum seal failed and the floor was flooded with conductive fluid. The preventable disaster was at its peak, and the man with the toothbrush was the only one left who knew how to turn it off. The Apex Gallery was no longer a place of business. It was a high-voltage kill zone. The white mist of the vaporized coolant hung in the air like a shroud, illuminated from within by the jagged, electrical strobe of the servers fighting for their lives. Every second, the subsonic thrum of the vibrating manifold grew louder, a deep, bone-shaking frequency that made the glass partitions groan in their frames. Julian Thorne was backed against the primary exit, his face a mask of sweating, incoherent terror. "It's going to ignite," he screamed, his voice cracking. "The vapor is conductive. The whole floor is a bomb. Sarah, we have to go." Sarah Chun didn't move. She was standing at the edge of the server cage, her eyes fixed on the man in the gray jumpsuit. Elias Thorne was crouched near the base of Rack 4, moving through the white fog with a terrifying rhythmic precision. He wasn't running, he wasn't panicking. He looked like a man who was finally back in his element, a master of a forgotten world. Elias reached the primary manifold coupling. It was shaking so violently that the steel was a blur. He could see the hairline fracture a jagged spiderweb in the titanium, where the super-chilled liquid was spraying out. Julian saw Elias reach for the pipe and his panic turned into a blind, desperate need to blame someone. He lunged for the intercom. "Thorne, get away from that manifold. You're sabotaging the equipment. Security. He's creating the leak. Shoot him if you have to." Elias didn't even look up. He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy, industrial zip tie and the wooden pencil he'd taken from the desk. "Julian, shut up." Sarah Chun's voice was a whip. She leaped down from the catwalk, her expansive heels clicking on the server floor as she moved toward the center of the mist. "He's the only one moving toward the heat. Let him work." Elias moved. He wrapped the zip tie around the base of the vibrating manifold, but he didn't tighten it yet. He slid the wooden pencil between the plastic strap and the steel pipe, creating a rudimentary but effective mechanical dampener. "You can't fix a $200 million AI with a pencil," Julian yelled from the doorway, his voice echoing off the concrete. "The software is in a recursive loop. You're just a janitor. The software is in a loop because it's trying to compensate for a mechanical impedance it can't measure." Elias roared back, his voice cutting through the roar of the servers like a saw. "Your Aegis AI is fighting the vibration by pulsing the pumps, but it's only magnifying the structural resonance. You're hitting the frequency coupling point of the rack subframe." He tightened the zip tie with a sharp, violent jerk of his wrist. Then, he used the pencil as a lever, twisting the zip tie until the tension on the manifold shifted. The sound changed instantly. The high-pitched scream of the manifold dropped an octave. Then two, before smoothing out into a low, rhythmic hum. The violet strobe of the servers faded back to a steady, pulsating blue. The hunting vibration, the one that had been threatening to tear the building apart. "Thermal load is dropping." Dr. Vane's voice crackled over the PA, his tone one of sheer, unadulterated shock. "Vibration at 0.02 microns. The manifold pressure is stabilizing. Someone just altered the physical resonance frequency of the entire rack." Elias stood up. He wiped a streak of conductive frost from his forehead. The white mist was beginning to be sucked out by the emergency ventilation, revealing the wreckage of the server cage. He looked at the manifold, then at the zip tie and the pencil. 10-cent fix, Elias grunted. "For $1 billion blind spot." Sarah Chun walked into the center of the bay. She looked at the manifold, she looked at the pencil wedged into the titanium housing. Then she looked at Elias. She didn't see the gray jumpsuit. She didn't see the shadow who emptied the trash. She saw a man whose mind operated on a level her entire engineering team couldn't comprehend. "Laminar flow turbulence," Sarah whispered, repeating the words Elias had used earlier. "You were right." The firmware was forcing a chaotic state in the coolant. Julian Thorne stepped into the room, his face transitioning from terror to a desperate, ugly arrogance. He saw that the danger had passed, and his primary instinct was to reclaim the status he had just lost. "I'll handle this, Sarah," Julian said, straightening his charcoal jacket, though his hands were still shaking. He pointed a finger at Elias. "Thorne, you've compromised the integrity of a high-security facility. You've used unauthorized materials on a proprietary system. I told you that if you touched a terminal, I'd have you blacklisted. Consider yourself fired. As of this second, the security is on their way to escort you to the police station for industrial sabotage." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look. At Julian, he reached down and picked up his mop bucket. "I'm done, Julian. I was done the moment I realized you were the one in charge of the future. He started to walk toward the exit, his stride heavy and tired. Wait, Sarah Chun said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped everyone in the room. She looked at Julian. You're firing him, he's a janitor, Sarah, Julian spat. He's a liability. He could have blown the whole floor. Sarah Chun walked toward Julian. She was 5'4", but in that moment she looked 10 feet tall. He's the man who just saved your life, Julian. He's the man who understood the physics of this machine while you were hiding behind a marketing presentation. And more importantly, she turned back to Elias. Her eyes were narrowed, searching his face. I know who you are now. I've been looking for the man who wrote the original Ether white paper for 7 years, the one who warned Titan Dynamics about the thermo runaway. The room went dead silent. Julian's mouth hung open. Elias Thorne, Sarah said, her voice hushed. The lead hardware architect who vanished after the Centurion blackout. The man they called the ghost of the machine. Elias stopped. He didn't turn around. He looked at the exit, thinking of Leo, thinking of the quiet life he had tried to build in the shadows. I'm just a janitor, Miss Chun, Elias said quietly. I'm the background noise. I'm the dust you have to erase. No, Sarah said, stepping in front of him. You're the only man in this building who knows how the world actually works. And Julian, she looked back at the vice president, her eyes cold and final. You're the dust. Collect your things. You're finished. Julian Thorne stood frozen as the reality of his instant regret finally hit him. He had challenged a man he thought was a nothing, a relic of a dead era, and in 60 seconds, that relic had just dismantled his entire world with a zip tie and a pencil. The justice delivered at Ethos Systems was swift, technical, and absolute, as Julian Thorne was led away by the same security team he had tried to weaponize against Elias. Sarah Chun turned her attention to the holographic log of the last 10 minutes. Julian didn't just ignore a warning, Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the data. He suppressed the physical reality of the machine to protect a software narrative that isn't a mistake, it's a structural failure of leadership. She turned back to Elias, who was still wearing his gray jumpsuit, looking out of place in the high-tech sanctuary of the bridge. I've spent the last 3 hours on the phone with the board and our legal team. We've authorized a retroactive IP recovery payment for the original architecture designs you produced at Titan Designs that Ether acquired in the merger, but never credited to you. She slid a sleek, encrypted tablet toward him. On the screen was a single number that made the room feel suddenly very quiet. $5 million. It's a combination of back pay, patent royalties, and a sign-on bonus for your new role as chief technical auditor, Sarah explained. Your son's therapy, the neurosupplements, the private schooling, it's all covered under the executive health package. You've spent long enough in the shadows, Elias. It's time the ghost of the machine took his seat at the table. Elias looked at the number. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't see a debt to be managed. He saw a world opened up for Leo. He didn't see the mockery of Julian Thorne. He saw a future where his son didn't have to be afraid of the noise. And Elias, Sarah added, her voice softening, that zip tie and the pencil, I'm having them framed for the lobby. I want every engineer who walks through those doors to remember that the most powerful AI in the world is useless if you don't have the common sense to level the floor. The sun was setting behind the spires of the city, casting long, golden shadows across the floor of Elias's new home, a quiet, soundproofed sanctuary where the only rumbles came from the wind in the trees, not the freight trains. Leo was sitting on a thick, soft rug, his hands steady as he worked on a new logic puzzle, this one made of polished silver and obsidian. He didn't have his headphones on. He looked up at his father and smiled, a real, unguarded smile. The map is right now, Dad. It clicks. Elias sat beside him, his large, scarred hands resting on his knees. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man who had been restored. Narrator. In an age of artificial intelligence and invisible code, we are taught to worship the screen and forget the steel. We judge a man's worth by the cleanliness of his hands and the prestige of his title. But when the digital world fractures and the machines begin to scream, a charcoal suit is just fabric, and an algorithm is just an opinion. True power is the mind that sees the truth in the dearth, a quiet genius who knows that the smallest mechanical detail is often the difference between a future that flies and one that burns. Never mistake a man's uniform for his mind, because one day you'll find yourself in the dark, praying for the man with the mop to save you.